Have you ever wondered who you are? And why do you do the things you do? Then you need to watch this video. Who is Black Sapien? To truly understand who the Black Sapien is, I must first define the elements that make up the Black Sapien entity. Understand this: the Black Sapien exists and has awareness. Thus the Black Sapien is defined in its totality as a being. There are but two types of existence: physical and non-physical. And both are needed in order to have awareness. All beings exist as a composition of physical and non-physical entities. We exist and become aware because of the interaction between the two elements of this being. This is defined as a duality. Duality is the underlying principle of all manifestations that come into existence. The Black Sapien has an internal being. This internal being is the Black Sapien consciousness. It was brought into existence because of the interaction between the duality, brain, and mind. The Black Sapien has an external being, its vehicle. The vehicle is given the function of the transportation and protection of the internal being, the Black Sapien consciousness. The vehicle is the Black Sapien physical body. A duality is also needed to reproduce the Black Sapien. The male must interact with the female to create another Black Sapien. You must look at the principle of duality as being the interaction of two opposites that create function. Take for example a magnet. It is composed of two polar opposites, one being positive and the other being negative. Independently, when the two forces interact, they repel each other. They repel or fight against each other because one has what the other needs to function independently. But when these two forces interact in a union, they combine to create the element magnetism. The force of magnetism is what causes the Earth to rotate, which creates gravity. Now let's begin. The Black Sapien exists as a composition of two distinct independent beings that exist as opposites. One element of the Black Sapien is its external being, vehicle. The Black Sapien vehicle is the transport system for the Black Sapien internal being, Black Sapien consciousness. The other element of the Black Sapien is its internal being, the Black Sapien consciousness. This being is created from the interaction between the Black Sapien mind and brain. The brain stores data as memory while the mind processes the data so it can be used by the Black Sapien consciousness. The Black Sapien vehicle requires exercise to maintain vehicle health. The vehicle also needs nutrients to sustain and maintain the vehicle. The vehicle must rest so that maintenance can be performed on the vehicle. Also, the Black Sapien needs a mate to create another Black Sapien being. The Black Sapien consciousness is composed of its own duality, of its conscience and its will. The Black Sapien consciousness does not need air, water, food or rest to exist. The Black Sapien consciousness needs input, knowledge, and experiences to function. Explaining the Black Sapien duality. The Black Sapien consciousness, its internal being, is composed of two elements that exist as non-matter and non-energy. These two elements are the non-matter conscience and the non-energy element, will. The vehicle is also given function by its own duality. The vehicle is composed of two elements that exist as matter and energy. The matter element of the Sapien vehicle is the Black Sapien physical body, and the energy element is spirit. Because the Black Sapien consciousness is composed of elements that are of a non-matter non-energy nature, the Sapien conscience is passive by nature. This means that it has no power in and of itself, and thus needs a power source to function. Because the Black Sapien conscience is receptive by nature, it is able to receive information sent to it by an input source. The non-energy element, will, is the active component of the Sapien consciousness. This means the will performs actions that require power, thus must receive its power from the conscience. Because a duality only exists as a composition of polar opposites, the non-matter non-energy consciousness must exist with its polar opposite component. Then the matter-body element, and the energy-spirit elements, must compose the unconscious element of this duality in order to function as a duality. The internal being of the Black Sapien is aware of its existence and its surroundings. It knows and understands. It is defined as being a self-conscious self-aware being. Its components of conscience and will combine to create a non-matter non-energy being that identifies as self. The matter-energy components of Black Sapien combine to create the Black Sapien external being. The Black Sapien physical body and spirit interact to create the unconscious being that identifies as, not self. Understand this. The Black Sapien consciousness, its internal being, identifies as, self, and exists as a duality composed of non-matter non-energy elements. Because the internal being, self, is composed of non-matter non-energy, it must receive function from an external source. This external source must be able to supply matter and energy to the internal being, the Black Sapien self, in order for the internal being to function. The Black Sapien brain receives input from external sources that are audio, visual, or physical like touch and smell. The Black Sapien also receives input from its external being, vehicle. The input source can be truth or non-truth. The brain stores input as memory for future use. The brain is an interface that connects the Black Sapien external being, vehicle, to its internal being, self. Thus, once the vehicle interacts with an input source, the interface sends input to the Black Sapien internal being, self. The mind of the Black Sapien then sends input to the Black Sapien internal being, self, thus giving function to the Black Sapien conscience. After the mind gives function to the Black Sapien conscience, the conscience can then give function to the will. Because the Black Sapien consciousness is composed of non-matter non-energy, it can only become a duality and function if the Black Sapien input source is its polar opposite, matter, energy. The Black Sapien input source can be real or non-real, and can be defined as truth and non-truth. By definition, truth is equivalent to power. By definition, non-truth is equal to non-power. Once the Black Sapien conscience has been given function, it then can give function to the Black Sapien will. The will of the Black Sapien is composed of non-energy. It is because of this that the will must receive function from the Black Sapien conscience, which was given function because of the input source. Once the Black Sapien will has been given function, it then can become active and can give output to the Black Sapien vehicle. The output of the will can only be an output of power or non-power. Remember this. Power in equals power out, and non-power in equals non-power out. Once the will has been given function or power, it then can give command to the external being, vehicle. The Black Sapien external being, vehicle, is the physical body of the Black Sapien. The internal being of the Black Sapien identifies as self. The Black Sapien self is non-matter non-energy. The Black Sapien internal being is composed of conscience and will. The Black Sapien conscience is reactive, which means it needs input first to stimulate a response. Once the conscience is stimulated, it can then give function to the Black Sapien will. The will, which is now active, has power to command the external being, vehicle. Important. Because truth equals power, when truth is the input source of the Black Sapien consciousness, it gives function to the Black Sapien conscience. In turn, the conscience is able to give function to the Black Sapien will. The will, now having power, has power to command the external being, the Black Sapien physical body, to create. Explanation of how the non-matter non-energy internal being, self, causes function to the matter-energy external being, not self. First, the Black Sapien internal being is given function by an external input source. The input source interacts with the brain, then, the input source is stored in the brain as memory. Once the input source is stored, the mind can then output the input source to the Black Sapien internal being, self. The self, once given function from the input source, gives function to the conscience. The Black Sapien self is passive, which means it first must receive function, in order to give function. Once the conscience receives function, it can then give function to the will, which now has power to command the Divine Spirit to give function to the vehicle. Definition: truth is that which does not violate the Divine Spirit, or the laws that govern the function of the Divine Spirit. By definition, the Divine Spirit cannot violate the laws of God or the universal laws of the universe. This is absolute. Only truth can command the Divine Spirit to give function to the external being, vehicle, to create. The process starts with a power source. First, the Black Sapien interacts with an input source. The source can be of a visible nature, or of an invisible nature, such as smell. The input source is received by the brain, and then processed by the mind to become output. That output will become the input source of the Black Sapien consciousness, self. Once the Black Sapien consciousness receives an input source, the input source can then give function to the Black Sapien conscience. Once the conscience has been given function, the conscience can then give function to the Black Sapien will. Because the Black Sapien internal being, self, is composed of the non-matter non-energy components, conscience and will, its input source must be composed of matter, energy, to cause function to the Black Sapien internal being, self. The Black Sapien consciousness has no power, in and of itself, thus needs power to function. Once the will is given function, it then can command the Black Sapien external being, with output, to cause function to the Black Sapien vehicle. Thus, the visible and invisible input source enters the Black Sapien consciousness to be converted into power, or non-power, as an output source into the external being. The Black Sapien external being, vehicle, is composed of body and spirit. The life-giving spirit that gives life and function to all living beings is identified as the Divine Spirit. Let's review. First, the input source interacts with the brain. Next, the conscience receives input from the mind. Now the conscience can then give function to the will, which can then command the Divine Spirit to give function to the Black Sapien vehicle. Understand this: truth equals power. If the input source is truth, then the input source will give function to the conscience, which in turn, will give power to the will, which can cause function to the vehicle. But, non-truth equals non-power, thus, if the input source is non-power, there is no power into the will and thus the Divine Spirit is not stimulated to give function to the Black Sapien vehicle. Understand this: there are two distinct, independent, spiritual beings that exist, interact and cause function within the sapien external being, vehicle. One spiritual being is the Divine Spirit. This is the spirit that gives life to all living beings. The other spirit is the animation spirit. The animation spirit is the spirit that causes movement in living beings. Explaining the Black Sapien external being, vehicle. The Black Sapien vehicle is composed of the Divine Spirit, the animation spirit, the mind, and the Black Sapien physical body. The Divine Spirit is the life-giving spiritual being that gives life to all living organisms. It is the Divine Spirit that provides power to, and control of, all Black Sapien vehicle systems. The Divine Spirit gives function to the animation spirit. The animation spirit gives function to the physical body. The Black Sapien mind desires input, and causes function to the Black Sapien consciousness. The Black Sapien physical body desires nutrients, and to reproduce. First, the will must command the Divine Spirit to give function to the animation spirit. Then, the Divine Spirit can give function to the animation spirit. Once function is given to the animation spirit can give function to the mind. Then the mind can cause function in the physical body. Now the physical body is able to cause function, and to create. If the will of the Black Sapien has been given power from the input of truth, the words spoken by the will, to command the Divine Spirit, will be words of truth and power that can then command the Divine Spirit. The Divine Spirit can then give function to the animation spirit, that can then give function to the physical body to create. To understand truth, you must first understand its definition. Truth is the property of being in accord with fact and reality. If you viewed truth and non-truth as being opposites, this would be true. Understand this: if all truth is true, then everything else would be false or non-truth. Remember this: all truth can be proven to be fact, an identity, a law, an absolute, or to be true. Now let's begin. First, an input source is needed to initiate the process. When the Black Sapien being interacts with an input source, the brain stores the input source as memory. Once stored, the mind can now send output to the Black Sapien internal being, self. This stimulates the Black Sapien conscience. Once the conscience has function, it can then give function to the will. Once the conscience gives function to the will can then command the Divine Spirit to give function to the Black Sapien external being, vehicle. After the will gives command to the Divine Spirit can then give function to the animation spirit. Once the Divine Spirit has given function to the animation spirit can then give function to the Black Sapien mind. Once the animation spirit has given function to the mind, the mind can then give function to the Black Sapien physical body to create. Important. The Black Sapien can interact with input sources of truth and non-truth. Understand this: truth equals power. Non-truth equals non-power. Power in equals power out. And non-power in equals non-power out. The Black Sapien physical body needs exercise, nutrients, and rest. The physical body desires food and to reproduce. Now, let's compare. Let's start with truth as the Black Sapien input source. This is the path of truth, when it is the input source. If the input source is truth, then the input source is a source of power. The input source gives function to the mind. The mind then gives function to the conscience, which then gives function to the will. The will, having function, then speaks words of truth and power, to give command to the Divine Spirit. Next, the Divine Spirit gives function to the animation spirit. The spirit of animation then gives function to the mind. And finally, the mind gives function to the Black Sapien physical body so it can create the desires of the Black Sapien. Now let's examine what happens when the Black Sapien input source is non-truth. This is the path of non-truth in the Black Sapien being. If the Black Sapien interacts with an input source that is non-truth, then the input source is not a source of power. Because the Black Sapien consciousness is composed of non-matter and non-energy, it needs matter and energy to function. The conscience needs matter but the will needs power. It is the input source that supplies power to the Black Sapien consciousness. Without power from an input source, the Black Sapien internal being cannot give function. Because the input source was non-power, the will does not have the power to command the Divine Spirit to give function to the Black Sapien physical body, to create. Thus, without its spiritual component, the physical body is controlled by the desire to survive. That is to eat and reproduce. Now, let's review. If the Black Sapien input source is a source of truth, then the Black Sapien being possesses a power source. This power source can give power to the Black Sapien will. With a power source, the will can now speak words of truth and power that can command the Divine Spirit to give function to the Black Sapien physical body to create, which is to bring into existence the desires of the Black Sapien being. But if the input source is non-truth, then the Black Sapien does not possess a power source. Without a power source to give function to the will to command the Divine Spirit, the Black Sapien has no desire but that of survival, and wanders the earth with only the desire to eat and reproduce. This may help you understand. If you look at the statement of identity, or statement of truth, you see what is called an absolute. This means that anything added to the equation that is not truth causes truth to become non-truth. You will also notice that the identity statement for non-truth is an absolute also. This means that adding more non-truth or truth to the equation will still result in non-truth. So, let's substitute a positive sign into the equation. We now get a positive equals a positive. The statement is still a balanced statement. You will find that you get the same results of its polar opposite. That is, non-truth equals non-truth. Or negative equals negative. Now remember, these are identity functions. This means they represent the absolute value of both sides of the equation. Let's continue. So, if we add truth plus truth, we get two truths, or two positives. So you can see that adding truth to truth increases truth, which is power. This is a true statement. Now, you will find that the same principles can be applied to non-truth, or negative. Now we see that the equation is still balanced, or both statements are still true. But what happens when we add truth to non-truth, or non-truth plus truth? Truth plus non-truth equals non-truth. This is because truth is an absolute, thus adding non-truth, which is an absolute also, to truth, will give a result of non-truth. But, wait a minute. Non-truth is an absolute also, so, adding truth to non-truth will still give a result of non-truth. Now, let's go back to the conclusion. Now, let me explain the Black Sapien. The Black Sapien being is a sapien being that exhibits the original pigmentation of dark, or black skin color. The Black Sapien is aware, and understands that the Black Sapien exists, and is also aware of its surroundings. This is defined as consciousness, and this consciousness exists as an internal being within the Black Sapien physical body. Together they interact to form or create the Black Sapien being. The Black Sapien being is a simple being. It is responsive by nature and can respond to input that is of truth. The Black Sapien has the ability to interact with external sources and convert these external experiences into power that allows the Black Sapien to create images and physical expressions of the Black Sapien consciousness, which identifies as self. Read the words of color at the bottom for this writer's comments. Thank you for watching.